thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I hope this is going to be an interesting counterpoint to the really interesting technical sessions that you've been going through this week. I have missed those. I've been in DC coming back from the Planetary Society's Day of Action. We had over 100 mostly regular folks coming to advocate for space science and NASA and space exploration in Washington, DC. It's been a busy last couple of months, as you might imagine, but I was really excited to get this invitation to talk to you today because this is an opportunity, I think, to try to condense a lot of ideas that I have been stewing on this last year. So I'll thank the organizers of the committee of this conference for the invitation and being patient while I came in very late with a lot of material at the very last minute. Been a busy couple of months. But also for this opportunity to try to force some of these ideas together about what I think is a really important inflection point that we're in terms of how we do space in the United States and potentially around the world. These ideas, I think, are you'll hear me working them out. So hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end of this, and I'll be very interested to hear your feedback from this. This is the first time that I will be presenting these ideas, so lucky you. I have actually, and I mainly written these down as a speech just for you all. So this is a good way, hopefully, that'll come across. Slides are mainly for visuals, so we'll see if this is interesting enough for you to listen to. Just real quick, most of you hopefully know what the Planetary Society is, my organization. For those of you who don't, the Planetary Society was formed in 1980. We're 45 years old this year, formed by Carl Sagan, Lou Friedman, and Bruce Murray. We're a public membership organization, so anyone can join. We have technical professionals, we have scientists, but most people are just members of the public around the world. And we're independent. We don't get government money and we don't have corporate donors, which actually is a great time at the moment, so we can be, I think, say what we think and talk about, space science, space exploration, search for life, planetary defense are big areas of interest. We're based in Pasadena. I get to live up here in the Seattle area, for which I'm grateful. We have colleagues also in Washington, D.C. So planetary.org if you're interested. We really care and are excited to talk about space in these big picture ways. All right, so I called this the policy value of a public space agency. And it's really, to me, the idea of why we have a public agency and what is unique about that, particularly right in this context of growing private and commercial activity. I assert that there is a fundamental distinction between public and private space activities. This is structural, right? So it's not necessarily a technical capability distinction, which is rapidly diminishing, or even ambition, which I think is almost outpacing some of the public statements. It's profoundly deeper, and I think this distinction is definitional, right? And it will express itself in the actions and responsibilities of these respective approaches to spaceflight. And knowing where to apply them is going to be really important. And my whole talk is really going to be around, I think, this idea of domain errors, about where we apply the respective strengths that are structural to these different approaches to space. Public space agencies reflect, in a sense, a collective democratic responsibility, while private space companies, at their core, are driven mainly by investor, market forces, or even the whims of an individual. This distinction really boils down to, again, this distinction between a collective and individualistic approach, not just in how and what their motivations are, I think, but also at fundamentally how they use language and what they appeal to others. I believe it's really important, again, to understand and acknowledge these differences because neither one I'll emphasize is correct, but because I think absent a clear understanding of these unique capabilities and style that each exploration enables, we risk overweighting one or the other and potentially losing something really important. I fear, and I'll just lay out my cards here, I fear that there is a shift underway happening right now, both in public opinion and, more importantly, at the public policy level, elected official level, that public space exploration has some inherent flaw, that it is at best a well-intentioned effort, but is ultimately incapable or unable to compete compared to more efficient private sector capabilities, and that the only path forward is to turn over more and more and more of what the public sector space program does to private industry. This is not just for services and missions, but even handing over national goals and the rhetoric as grandiose, right, as saving humanity itself becoming a privatized effort, not a collective one. In so doing, I think this shift from what a collective unifying activity that appeals to a broad sense of shared values is what a public space agency does, into one primarily identified with an individual or small group of people. This has consequences, I think, to how the rest of the nation sees this endeavor, as one associated with a person or one associated with a nation. And that, I think, is distinct. I believe this shift is happening very quickly, and its implications to the national, again, sense of what space exploration is, to the fundamental bipartisan or nonpartisan nature of what space exploration is, or to even to the fundamental expectations of what a space program owes the people who fund it, are not really being fully discussed, and how those may change with the one shift to the other. A shift is not always going to be bad in all senses, and I really do want to emphasize right now, even setting this up, that this is not an anti-commercial space or anti-private space screed by any sense of the word. I think the growth of private space in the last 20 years has been one of the most important developments in spaceflight history that we've seen, and it has incredible opportunities and successes. My concern is how we talk about it and where we apply it, particularly from a policy perspective, what we expect these capabilities to do and on whose behalf. And I also think that, again, understanding what we have and its relationship to as an expression of some sort of national representation has in itself unique capabilities that are just fundamentally distinct of the different type of organizations of space, private or public. These risks, I think, come out from this consequence that the US in particular has, in a sense, over-optimized on cost savings. And in doing so, I think we've introduced, we've tried to reduce cost risk, but in the sense of doing so, we've introduced secondary other types of risk. Say reputational, the risk of politicization, the risk of potential alienation in the sense of public from its own space program, and the risk of even losing access to an important generative aspect of a national collective activity, right? That we going into space and discovery-oriented activities in science. These risks are much harder to measure than dollars, right? Dollars are great because they can count them. At this Planetary Society, that's what I do. I go into the budgets. I love counting dollars, right? It's very straightforward. There's lots that you can pull out of that way. But I've become convinced over the last year and years thinking about this, that there are more intangible aspects of what we do, not just in terms of what we generally talk about in going to space, but in how we do it and the activity of doing it and how we organize ourselves to do it. This is much, again, harder to capture, and I think also broadly more culturally, we've become less capable of talking about types of activities that aren't as easily measurable. We are a very quantized society. So by fixating, I assert, on these kind of quantifiable metrics alone, we risk devaluing kind of these deeper, more profound and potentially elusive benefits. Anything from just an expression of national value or ambition or ideal to something as broad as giving us access to wonder and awe and aspects of the sublime, which we don't have as many opportunities for in our day and age. So this is our broad cultural thing. Private space exploration predates this current era. And it's worth looking at kind of the historical evolution of how we have a public space program compared to where we are now. So, right, 7 decades, give or take, of roughly 7 decades of going into space, started the space age. And that entire time has been defined, right, by a collective approach to space exploration. If you were born in the 20th century, some of you were not here, but I'd say for those of us who were, NASA is essentially synonymous with spaceflight and space exploration, certainly. There was almost no other way to conceive of it. And that is so, I think, deeply baked into the cultural sense of what space is and the activity of space, the values around space, right? How we see movies like Apollo 13 or others show what space is, right? As this noble group effort, right? that is representative of our ambition and ideals of teamwork and grit and curiosity and determination. These are all outcomes of this collective activity that we have had since the very beginning, right? NASA has been always focused as a group, a team activity. It's one of the, hear any NASA folks talk, at any successful launch, it's always thanking the team. The broad, I think, consequence of this is that NASA is unusually popular for a government agency, wildly popular, actually. It is not just the most popular agency in government, sometimes tied with the post office, but up there. NASA is a source of selling, things like T-shirts. How many other government agencies have their logo on T-shirts at the Gap, right? The Department of Interior would not move a lot of T-shirts with their logo. And that's actually, it's worth thinking about why that is, right? NASA is a symbol to the public of all of these things itself, right? And it's an accessible symbol and it's a unifying symbol, right? As I assert through its action of being a collective endeavor, ultimately paid for by the taxpayer. Last public approval poll of NASA had it at 78% favorability. I don't think kittens would poll that well these days. That's truly astonishing. And that's by both political parties and even members of Congress. It is a nonpartisan activity, hopefully still. This situation we're in, again, I assert is really unusual. And so this, this idea that when NASA was formed, of course, in 1958, there was no private option to even consider, right? It was almost impossible to conceive of. But this wasn't always so, right? So in situ space exploration began, you can arguably say, so you had some V2 rockets going into suborbital flights in the 40s, but you say 40s, 50s, obviously Sputnik really kicked it up in 57. But before that, there's another type of space exploration, I think, which is collecting photons, right? Looking out into space. This was the grand space exploration efforts of the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe and the United States. And this was a purely private activity in the United States. There was no government funding for building any observatories of these grand observatories that you've seen. So before we had rockets and before we had Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, we had people like James Lick and Charles Yerkes. Industrial robber barons or barons, very wealthy individuals who would, through their own initiatives and working with highly motivated individuals like Edwin Haley, seek out and fund the construction of these large, grandiose, beautiful observatories throughout the country. There had been a number of efforts actually to build a national observatory seen as, in Europe you had these royal observatories funded by the royal governments, but Congress repeatedly, from mid-1800s onwards, repeatedly refused to fund it, thinking it was just not a function of the federal government to pay for those. So as a consequence, there was kind of a by hook or by crook, build what you could. There were some interesting early experiments in basically civic subscriptions, crowdfunding by any other means for an observatory in Cincinnati. But most of these were built by a wealthy individual as a patron. This was really explored in Alex McDonald's book, The Long Space Age. He was formerly the chief economist of NASA. This is where I got some of these numbers. It's worth noting against how much one of the great insights in his book is adjusting for inflation to try to figure out how much these people were actually spending. It's not an easy thing to do in the 19th century to now. But if you take some of their expenditures as a percentage of overall gross domestic product, what we do here, you see some of these are equivalent to small to mid-sized planetary spacecraft missions funded by an individual, right? So Yerkes Observatory, roughly $400 million. That's your messenger spacecraft-ish. Lick Observatory, you're getting closer to something like Juno, right? These are huge. And I think Lick spent something about 20% of his personal fortune just on that one observatory, right? So this is a kind of a parallel to what we've seen in the last 20 years, right? With very wealthy individuals starting to put some of their own money into spaceflight activities outside of NASA. I think Jeff Bezos is probably the closest parallel here, But I would even mention Jared Isaacman, now the nominee for NASA administrator, who, though they haven't verified it, has been reported to have paid on the order of $200 to $300 million for his flights into space on SpaceX's Dragon. So we're seeing, again, expenditures on the orders of hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. Jeff Bezos, just to give him credit, he's spending a Lick observatory every year, which is quite a bit, but he's got a lot to pull from, so I'm all for that. But patronage, of course, has its limits when you're actually trying to do science, right? It's, I think, human condition, it makes us, our brains, we like things, we like concrete things, right? Like to hold the thing in our hand, we like specific starts and ends, we like events, right? Causality machines is our brains. And it's a lot harder to get private money to do an open-ended thing, like science. So a quote that many of you may still resonate with, and those of you particularly trying to get funding for ongoing activities, 1886, right? So we've built these observatories without proper instruments. They wait idle for want of observers and able astronomers unprovided with the means of doing useful work. So we built the system, you know, we had private funds were able to build the capabilities, but they never consistently showed up to actually use them. And that was the case throughout, for the 150 years where observatories are being built in the United States. Obviously, some were able to do it. University foundations and universities' professors were able to do it. But a broad, sustained opportunity for scientific or other types of operational work with no clear outcome was very hard to do from a private model. As someone who's worked at, for the last 13 years, a nonprofit that depends on donors, I can concur that this is a difficult thing to do for activities that don't have clear endpoints, right? So this is a fundamental challenge of a purely private activity. You have, in a sense, a stochastic level of engagement of individuals who, for any number of reasons, Yerkes was actually convicted of blackmail and bribery and was trying to kind of launder his name back, and so he did it with some, pay money to build an observatory, makes him sound really good. Who knows, right? It's very fickle when you are dealing with an individual. You no longer have a group of people to appeal to. You're appealing to the whims of a person with all the attendant weirdness and complexities and uncertainties that one person's brain will bring to the party. So this was the case, obviously, through the 19th century. 20th century, things started to change slowly. Really, obviously defined, I'll kind of speed past this from a historical point, but really World War I has started to kick up the idea like, oh, maybe we should invest in airplanes and things from a national security perspective. But even then, after World War I, Robert Goddard, who had invented liquid rocket engine, could not get barely could get any government funding for the life of him, right? And was able to cobble together what he did, mainly through Smithsonian and other private donors. And then the United States found out that, oh, maybe the Nazis decided differently. They invested in the V2 and they had the rocket in World War II. So it was really the end of World War II that created this a fundamental shift in expectation of what the government did. And I always like to pause on this because this is so important, I think, in terms of realizing both that this was a decision, it was a political decision, and it happened within the lifetime of a lot of people who are still alive. My uncle was born in 1944 when this report came out, right? This report, Science: The Endless Frontier, by Vannevar Bush, written to Franklin Roosevelt at the time, made the argument that the nation has a profound self-interest in investing in basic science and research, and technology and scientific research. Not just for national defense, which they had just learned right from World War II, how'd you win the war, atomic bombs, radar, right, rockets, but also public health, the overall commitment to knowledge, and building the capability to do all these brand new things that we don't know will happen because we haven't discovered them yet. This case was made in 1944, right? Again, my uncle is as old as the case for science funding in the United States. And 5 years later, the National Science Foundation was formed as a direct consequence of this report, starting in the 1950s, and then obviously Cold War kind of kicked up a lot of those investments. But it was a decided and deliberate decision to do this, and it was a profound shift, right? Before this, there was just very, very little money being spent, and most of it was applied science or applied technology. Now it was opening up to say, well, what can we figure out? So this is where we had this foundation of when in situ space exploration started to happen, right? That we had now a foundation of there was a role of government in providing funds for scientific and technological activities. There was a broadly at the time culturally, after going through the Great Depression and World War II, a shared sense of community that a lot of people had endured something together, and a high level of trust in public institutions. So this was the founding time when NASA became an agency in the late 1950s. It became an agency in this context. And so there was no question that space exploration would be a government activity. Not only, of course, then the alignment to the fact that the amount of resources you required to marshal it, the technical proficiency, the levels of skilled engineering and manufacturing required to make it work, all kind of led towards government investment. So this approach to space obviously has only changed very recently. And one could argue, I think mainly we have a public space program, or private space program now, because in a sense, the public program laid a huge amount of investment, both in infrastructure capabilities, but also fundamental research and design. So we had enabled this, right, through, again, a decided and intentional public policy approach applied to a novel capability of going into space. But the point wasn't, it was not a choice, right, between a public and private investment. It was the natural outcome at the time. As space exploration became an expression of public activity, how we talked about it changed as well. In the early 20th century, right, going back again to before spaceflight, but when we had the ideas that rockets could exist, you started having early science fiction, you started having ideas of what could be, and you had people starting to actually pitch the idea of investing in spaceflight, right? Wernher von Braun was one, Willy Ley was another, people like Arthur C. Clarke. They were purposely and intentionally trying to build a case for why we should invest in spaceflight. When the technology was, I think, right on the edge, but the idea was there. The language that they used, I think, is really interesting. Obviously, a lot of you are familiar with this idea of associating space with the frontier, right? Westward expansion, the idea of the American romanticized ideal of expanding out west United States, of course, not acknowledging the displacement and consequences for the native tribes that were here beforehand. But this early 20th century romantic ideal of the individual explorer, right? The individual frontiersman, individualism fundamentally, right? This deep-rooted American ideal in the 20th century was being purposely applied to the idea of space, that you would expand that frontier now from the west out into space. The endless, what is this called? The endless frontier, right? The final frontier, right? It's all very built into that. Clarke took that even further, associating space not just with, in a sense, exploration and adventure, but individual transcendence and a species level, right, transcendence. That he saw space as like a mediating factor to bring humanity to help it evolve into something higher, right? Spoiler alert, what's 2001: A Space Odyssey about, right? It's turning us into angels, only by going into space, right? So there is a profound personal pseudo-spiritual relationship that he was pitching. These are not fundamentally rational arguments, right? These are appeals to romanticism, to the individual, right? To our right brain side of ourselves that makes us feel something bigger, right? He's evoking something really profound when they bring up these ideas. I like to illustrate this with, since we're in Seattle, so this is romanticism, romantic ideal. This is an 18th, 19th century era artistic and cultural movement, again, that emphasized emotion over, in a response actually to Enlightenment rationalism. It's like the human being is a spiritual, experiential being. Themes of romanticism are everywhere. For those of you who are sticking around in Seattle, if you're not going to, I recommend going to the Seattle Art Museum, the SAM. You will see this beautiful, this is a piece of it actually. It's a huge romantic, like American romantic landscape painting as a whole genre of oil painting. They have a couple of really fine examples here in Seattle of the Pacific Northwest. This particular one is by Albert Bierstadt, who had never been to Pacific Northwest, right? This is the essence of a romantic painting, scale, scope. You see the very tiny people beyond this like overwhelming presence of nature that is both intimidating, but also beautiful and evocative and welcoming and inspiring. What is there? All of this, right, is a romantic expressionism of what the West could be, right? And this is where, compare this to like a Chesley Bonestell painting from the in situ space age, right? This is Titan, Saturn is seen from Titan. Chesley Bonestell, like Albert Bierstadt, had never been to where he was painting, right? He was not standing on the surface of Titan, but look at the same evocation of grand scale, this broad, like romantic presentation of nature, not scientifically accurate, right? Though they, of course, to be fair, they didn't know Titan had an atmosphere in 1950. But this is a version, this is what was being presented to the American public of selling space before space was actually a public activity, right? They were trying to evoke something, trying to make you feel something very powerful and inspirational about it at a level, again, that borders on a spiritual or sublime experience. This began to change as government funded space, and this is, I'd say, broadly true of science as well. Not only because, was this the only way to talk about space back in the let's say teens through 50s. There was no public policy apparatus to appeal to, right, to give more money for NASA when NASA didn't exist. There was no office of, chief science and technology policy office in the White House. This didn't exist yet until Eisenhower created them. There was no existing policy discussion to have about space, right? The only way to talk about it was actually through some appeals to evocative emotion. Now that you had a public apparatus for space, you had to start talking about it in a public policy context. And for the first 10 years, NASA didn't have to compete with that, right? During Apollo, it was basically the equivalent of a wartime marshaling of resources. Outside of war, actually, the United States has never marshaled that much resources, material, manpower so rapidly, besides Apollo. That didn't last, as a lot of you know, right? We are no longer on the moon. And as it wound down, there was a profound shift in policy. This was Nixon in 1971 saying to NASA, and this was actually the Nixon space doctrine, is that you are no longer special. You are a function of government now. And like any other function of government, you will compete for resources with everyone else, right? So instead of being at the top of the line, in front of the line, you're kind of jostling elbow to elbow with every other activity that government does. This was the demotion of NASA to a standard government activity, which meant that suddenly the justification of NASA had to become one of practicality in a public policy context. What are you doing for the nation measurably? Are you creating jobs? Are you investing in high-skilled engineering and industry? Are you creating new STEM students what the nation needs, right? Everything started to be measured as a practical outcome. Now, this maybe sound like I'm saying this is a bad thing. This is not a bad thing, right? These are all good things. And this is good to talk about them that way. But I think the shift started to happen more and more. And there was a diminishment of, in a sense, the romantic, individualistic appeal of what our public space program did to one primarily focused on broad cultural and collective impact. And then also over time through more and more of a practical, somewhat dispassionate, bloodless policy perspective. I say that as a policy person. Mike Griffin, who was the NASA administrator under George W. Bush towards the end of that presidency, likened this distinction to what he called real and acceptable reasons for spaceflight. Has anyone read this paper or speech? No one has listened to my podcast, huh? I had him on 4 months ago. I recommend it. That speech in the form of a paper, I think, is actually one of the most insightful ways to frame how we understand how we talk about what our space program does and to whom we talk to it about and why we justify it, right? So in his framing, real reasons are the romantic reasons, the ones that make you feel something. He likened spaceflight to the modern creation of cathedrals, right? A grand activity serving some broader spiritual but also beneficial purpose, while it's being built, that maybe the instigators of would never see its finish, right? You're part of a narrative. You're part of something that will ultimately serve, and save the souls of humanity. which again starts to sound like very similar maybe themes that we're hearing from other actors right now in terms of spaceflight. These real reasons are what he declares to be, in a sense, that you can see it from his framing, the true and honest ones. But again, they are all appeals to the individual, right? The practical and acceptable reasons are, feel like this. It's this, so like doing your homework, right? What's the economic multiplier factor of NASA investment in northern Alabama? That's why we need to go to the moon. Well, okay. I always talk about this. We have people who come from all across the country to advocate with us in Washington, D.C., and they don't come because they're concerned about what the economic multiplier in North Carolina is. They're coming because they want NASA to be a cathedral. But we ask them to talk about why it's actually a pile of paperwork. Now, there are reasons for this, right? Why do we have all these practical discussions? Because we live in a multicultural democracy where you cannot take the fundamental cultural values of the people around you for granted, right? And so you are driven, you are forced to find somewhat objective, measurable ways to justify national expenditures that are ultimately discretionary. We don't have to do them. Space is not, unfortunately, written into the Constitution. And as a consequence, though, this trend towards, I would argue, this practical reasons, however valid it is, leaves a gap and leaves something missing, I think, to how we talk about what we do in space. And it kind of left an opening and an opportunity for others to claim that mantle for what they were doing. So in a sense, this became the ultimate collective, in a sense, almost too kind of collective focused. And the role of the individual within this broader sense, I would assert, was lost. So this is where I think the role of private spaceflight really begins to enter into this story. Because again, and terms, right? Private spaceflight, I'm going to just kind of use private spaceflight to represent this modern era of commercial private, individual-led, ambitious, independent, right? Boeing is, yes, it's a private company, Lockheed's a private company, but they don't have goals beyond serving the government. I would assert these are defined companies that have their own goals that sometimes align with NASA goals or not. Welcome to debate me on that. But that's roughly what I'm going to be talking about. So this modern, right, the last 20 or so years of companies that represent this. As I said earlier, I think this is actually a profound and incredibly important and one of the probably the most important development in spaceflight in the last 50 years, that we have a capable commercial and private sector that is willing to put in money to do really crazy and exciting things. But what I think is really interesting is the language and the rhetoric that is embraced by this commercial sector is much more aligned with that romantic ideal from 100 years ago than practical. And I think that is an expression of the fact that they are individualistic initiatives, right? They are tied to, particularly the most notable ones, tied to their founders almost inseparably, right? And this is the ultimate, again, this distinction between a collective national effort and an individualistic role of the private sector in spaceflight is profoundly different than what we have grown up with, at least most of us, and profoundly different, I think, to how the public has internalized the role of space in society. The language, of course, that Elon Musk uses is to save humanity by going to Mars. That is like a religious theology almost, right? A salvation theology, as Roger Lowney has called it, chief historian of NASA. That is not a practical or acceptable paperwork reason. That is going to Mars and building the cathedral for humanity. Right? Jeff Bezos, right, moving all industry, making Earth and Eden, right? There we go with this kind of pseudo-religious language again. Virgin Galactic, others, right? They have these grand ambitions that are emotive, that try to make people feel something, right? And again, I think that is inseparable from the fact that these are individual, generally individually led companies. There's an interesting paradox here that while the rhetoric is profoundly romantic, the actual application, particularly for things that aren't government funded of these private companies, are relentlessly utilitarian, right? Because they have to be, because there's no market for going to space, or there's no market for saving humanity. There's no market for discovering life on Europa. There is a market to go up into space and turn back and point downwards at things, right? Whether you're reflecting satellite signals or communications or taking pictures of the Earth for various agricultural, national security reasons, whatever. The market is on Earth, and so you go into space to look down, and what does SpaceX do? They build communications satellites. That's what they do with their own money. They build rockets, which they can sell to whomever wants them. Jeff Bezos, Blue Origin's a little different because they don't need a market because he's basically funding it. But at the end of the day, Blue Origin has not built a science mission to Europa either, right? They're focusing on the infrastructure. So I don't quite have an answer for why that is beyond, I think it's more of an expression of the individual in the context of, and I think this is my fundamental argument, that there are structural distinctions that are worth paying attention to of privately run companies versus publicly run organizations. And again, really want to emphasize, this is all fine that these exist. This is not an anti-private spaceflight thing. It's just emphasizing the distinction of how we use the words to talk about them. But I think the romantic language has obscured, in a sense, this relentless utilitarian focus of what these companies do. So, partly though, something I think is really interesting is there's a lot of exciting things too, right, that I think people can connect with. This is Jared Isaacman, again, maybe the next NASA administrator, basically doing the equivalent of summiting Mount Everest, right, in the 19th century, or 20th century. The idea of adventurism, right, becoming of the individual returning to spaceflight, or maybe coming to it for the first time, but coming into it in a real way. NASA would never do this mission, right? Why would the risk is too high, but hey, people can now, right, if they want to. And there adds a level of excitement, but again, this is for the individual, right? This is adventurism as you projecting yourself into the role of someone doing something kind of crazy and exciting. You cannot justify this in a public policy arena. You just can't apply the resources to that. That doesn't make sense. But maybe this is why we have, again, we start to have options now, right? Instead of completely one or completely the other, there's actually an interesting set of realities now enabled by both. This is fun. Again, so I'll just say, ChatGPT made the numbers. This is to illustrate a point, maybe provocatively, but it's just to illustrate a point. And I asked it to, so a lot of you may know the democracy index by the Economist research, kind of has a generally way to observe the level of democratic institutions in every country in the world from 1 to 10. The point that I'm making here, and this is where I'm kind of moving, is that there are, despite kind of what this romantic ideal and the exciting things that private space can do, the structural advantages of a public agency are really important from a broader set of values than, again, this overfocus on cost alone. There are inherent capabilities and responsibilities that a public agency has by the virtue is that it's enabled by the public and has oversight by public representatives and uses public money. They have a responsibility to be transparent and open with what they do. They have a responsibility to take input from elected officials and from citizens. The Planetary Society can go to DC and advocate for NASA things that we'd like to see. We cannot go to Jeff Bezos and advocate. Well, that would be nice, I suppose, but we can't go through any sort of structured process. There's no open, it is neither requested nor are there avenues to do so effectively, right? There is no opportunity for citizen input on what private companies do because they're private companies. They don't have to. They owe their, shareholders or whatnot. Public agencies can be a symbol of national will or national values. That is really important if you want to partner with other countries and give it either some kind of democratic imprimatur or relationship formally with the United States. You cannot do that with a private company. It just does not work that way. And if which I believe we are, in a democracy, there is at a certain sense who our government is reflects our broader nation itself. And so taking that to an extent, what NASA does as a public institution in a democracy is a fundamental representation of our values, and I'd say our ideals, right? What would we like to see ourselves as? Curiosity as a value, capability, ambition, grit, determination, cooperation. These kind of high status values that we want to say, if we had to tell our kids, what kind of person do I want you to be? I would point at NASA and say, be like that. In terms of the ideal sense of what we're trying to represent. And by conversely, what NASA does not do also says something about our nation. There is, again, accountability and oversight that I mentioned earlier. NASA tells you where it's spending money, what its contracts are. I've been counting all the contracts that NASA's been canceling lately. That's all public information. It's by law, they have to, right? It's easier if they didn't share it, but they have to. It's great to know where they spend the money, where the jobs are. It's great to know that if you have members of Congress with direct oversight responsibilities to the agency, and if you don't like those members of Congress, you can elect other ones, right? There's a whole area of ways in which public sentiment can apply pressure, direction, goals, outcomes on what we do in space in a public agency that just do not make sense in a private one. Private ones, and again, are these expressions of an individual. These are collective ways that distribute, in a sense, all the sort of idiosyncrasies and quirks of individuals through a larger system to try to, balance those out a bit. So again, I asked ChatGPT to basically say if you had to apply the democracy index to, NASA and a handful of private companies, just to illustrate again, right, openness, right, the ability to, impact what they do, oversight. This is a way to kind of think about, if we start turning over a lot of space activity to companies that are only dimly transparent or not transparent at all, or fully controlled by one individual or a handful of individuals or responding to certain sectors over another, you are kind of moving from Denmark to Turkey or Ecuador in terms of a human rights or human democracy level participation. I think that's worth thinking of, right? That this is a level of we take for granted, again, because so many of us have grown up with NASA as the fundamental relationship between you and space, that these are inherent and always going to be the case. I remember very vividly, it may have been SpaceX's second launch way back in, it must have been 2011 or 2012. They were delayed and they cut their live feed. And people got so mad on the internet. And it was a reminder though, they don't owe us a live feed. They don't. They do it because it's convenient. It gets great press. They like to do it. They don't have to. NASA has a responsibility to give us that because it is a public institution that's responsible to the public. And so at any time, even things that these companies do that are aligned with our values, they only do that because it is a choice that they make. And generally, they can change their whims. They don't have to. And that is, I think, needs to be said, that there is these things happen not because we wish that it's always going to be the case, but because we've tried to create these expectations, norms, but also in NASA's case, the fundamental responsibility, right, of oversight and openness. Now, obviously, this cuts both ways. It's a lot easier to be efficient when you don't have to have 18 hearings about closing down one, minor, secondary contracting center in Northern Carolina. And there is an inverse relationship in some degree between level of democratic oversight and efficiency. And so there's easy to go too far too. And this isn't to say that there's a public is the only way to go. There are consequences, right? Democracy is inefficient, right? Democracy seeks input from all sides of parts of the citizenry. It is meant to have opportunities for people to weigh in. It is not meant to enable very rapid decisions unless you start shaving off bits of input opportunity, right? Now, obviously, there's a fine balance to strike between too much efficiency and too much red tape and oversight. Obviously, we're going through a big discussion of that right now in this country. But there is, I'll just say too, there is advantage to, again, private sector allocation of resources being much far more efficient and what they do best, right? So again, it's going to be where do we apply these domains and where do we expect them to be uniquely capable and where do we need to make sure we're not applying the wrong lessons to the wrong part of the domain of what they do. Something else that's really important to mention, of course, is that, as I said earlier, a lot of these private companies, even unless they're paid by the government to do it, are not doing fundamental scientific research or exploration or research. There's been Rocket Lab, maybe it comes the closest with their Venus mission, but they have emphasized, and I actually interviewed Peter Beck on the podcast, that it is a nights and weekend project. It's a volunteer project, and it will always be secondary to any other business case, business requirement that they have, right? That is not true when we built Europa. Some of you built Europa Clipper, or any other science mission that we've done, right? That is a fundamental that is written into US code in US law that NASA will expand human knowledge of space and Earth. That is a fundamental objective of the space agency. There's no market, right, for exploratory breakthrough space science, but that's not why we do it. There are broader benefits that are not measurable by dollars, and that's kind of goes to my point. I will also argue that there is a broader societal benefit by these types of activities that are enabled by public programs that don't have immediate market return. There's a term called collective effervescence. It was coined by a French sociologist, Émile Durkheim, about the idea of a shared experience among a group as being a way to cohere and to tighten together kind of a national identity, a civic identity, right? These can be good and bad, but I think space offers a huge number of opportunities for exciting things that bring, in a sense, a shared level of experience. Obviously landing on the moon, but even things like Curiosity on Mars being such a widely watched, or Perseverance, or any of those Mars landings being so widely watched. The action of pursuing noble endeavors like discovery, scientific knowledge. Again, I think it's just important to say that that is in itself a good thing to do, right? That it has a social benefit to encourage not just curiosity, but skepticism and integration of new ideas and modeling, and being willing to change hypotheses and models of the world in order to accommodate new data. All of that is socially beneficial into a fundamental kind of engagement with our beyond and other domains. And, of course, cooperative, space is cooperative, the teamwork aspect of it, the international cooperation aspect. And I would even argue that there's a societally generative role of just bringing in novel information, right? The world is so well explored, and data has been so well collected and archived and chunked up and digested, particularly in these new AI systems, that new information, novel information that's coming from some external source, I think is going to become more and more important. And that has to be sought out. It's not granted to us in revelation. It is sought out by going to places to find new things. And that kind of feedback, infeed of novelty, of uncertainty, of discovery is actually, again, profoundly important, I think, for societal, generative's kind of societal activity, and in a sense, forcing us to look up and out instead of down and in to our cell phones. The downsides risk, again, I think, of applying private space to where, in a sense, public space, these unique capabilities, when it doesn't match like that, right? When you take, again, a collective endeavor and make it applied to an individual, a lot of the things we've taken for granted about that public endeavor start to fall away or become questioned. I am very concerned that space will become a partisanly coded activity, merely by the relationship of one individual to other individuals, not even as some of you may like it, some of you might dislike it, but just merely the alignment of an individual as a personal representative of an aspect of what we do in space to a political party creates an induced political opposition. This is a well-studied phenomenon for a variety of topics. Space is not inherently grounded as a bipartisan activity. It just has been, because it's been pursued as a collective activity. So the application of an individual to that collective activity runs the risk of reputational collapse. We may have started to see this in the data. The US General Social Survey that has asked questions about space, whether it's been funded enough or not enough, over 50 years, saw for the first time in 10 years a tick downward, and that's getting too much. I want to see, very much looking forward to data release this year to see if that trend continues. It was right after the private space flights of 2021, was that? And there's this, so there could be reputational risk that we're seeing here. There's other risks, of course, in terms of, again, however the whims of individuals apply to broader national goals. If we put national goals down onto the capability of one person, that's a huge amount of trust, but also not only the proverbial getting hit by a bus, but also the whims if someone's mind changes, right, or decides to do something else. Jeff Bezos, if he wanted to tomorrow, could make Blue Origin only make sewing materials, right? And that's what they would do, right? And so anyone who would bet on that being the long-term way that they were going to access or make their business around would be out of luck. And so national systems have these ways to help provide reliability and long-term capability, or at least give you the option to tell them about that. So, and again, public input, I think, is a really important one that I'm concerned about. So again, this collective effervescence, this collective experience, I think we are facing a choice right now. And we have seen, I think, an increasing number of people say that the solution to every problem is to commercialize it or privatize it away. Now, that may be true in a lot of cases, and I think we have seen an incredible amount of capability coming from that. But at the end of the day, I believe that if we aren't careful, we can and are creating an impression that privatization or individualistic solutions are the replacement for a collective endeavor, and that we're not fully considering the outcomes and implications of that change. And that if we do that, we would lose, I think, something really noble and valuable and unique that we've spent almost 70 years building. And that representation of ourselves back to ourselves, right? NASA's not just a space agency, it's a mirror back onto society. That starts to fracture. And it would be the greatest tragedy, I think, for me, if space became another area of division as opposed to what it has been, which is a profoundly unifying activity that has brought people together of these shared positive experiences. So when I look forward, I really believe that we should really think hard about what are the respective strengths of each of these types of capabilities. What are the unique capabilities of NASA, which I think I've outlined a lot today, and unique capabilities of private sector, some of which I mentioned, being efficient, resource allocation, ambitious, being able to pivot and be responsive to market demands and customer needs, that applying them very judiciously and really hammering in of where the public space agencies are unique: scientific exploration, breakthrough science, technological development, symbolic representation, education, right? Unifying activities that are bringing the nation along with it, and also fundamentally staying in charge of where it's going, right? That the public agencies, I believe, should be leading the direction of goal setting, policy setting, and that everyone comes with them. If they lose that role, then the public agency becomes a follower to something else, which I think is the incorrect role for a public agency. So this role is a very interesting time that we're in. I think there's a huge amount of opportunity that we're in. But at the same time, I do think we really need to start thinking and get better about NASA itself re-embracing this romantic ideal. And not that we abandon its collective endeavor or collective pursuit, or even in any way changing its responsibilities to the public, but being more comfortable, and that's like at us even at an individual level, to talk about the right-brained aspect of this, the real reasons, right? The romantic ideals of what we're trying to express. Because again, even though in a public policy sense, public space agencies have, in a sense, a dispassionate, very practically minded set of arguments and justifications for them, they are the institutions that actually do the most romantic, wild, and ambitious things that lift the spirit, right? Going to Mars to look for life, going to Europa, making James Webb to look to the recombinant period of the early solar system. These are things that stir my soul. I imagine they stir some of your souls too, even though they're talked about in the jobs that they create in various sectors and contracts they do, right? And so ironically, again, it is the language, I think, that we can re-embrace of the most romantic ideals are an expression of collective will. And I think that collective will says something really good about us. And I think in endorsing that and protecting that and embracing that will make us do more of that in the long run. So thank you for listening to this today. I was worried I wouldn't get to an hour, but I have less time for questions than I hope, but I'm happy to answer if anyone has questions or wants to yell at me about that, please.
I did want to ask a question. I'm over here.
Go ahead.
To your point of the romanticism of the individual, looking at a more macro level, has NASA not, from a policy perspective over the course of, pick your decades, 40, 50, whatever years, made that romanticism the policy of eat your Wheaties, study your math, let's go live and work in space, let's go to the moon and Mars, and now that's just manifested into the individual romanticism?
There's been I think the way that NASA's talked about itself has a certain dispassionate romanticism about it, right? And it's always done in a very eat your Wheaties perspective. But this is good for you, let's do it. Or tautological. Why do we explore? Well, because we're explorers. That's what we do. And I guess. But like, it's, I think, a deeper, to me, romanticism is a more, you're not just living on Mars or living on the moon or something or living in space. Romanticism would be a more profound, what does that mean to you to experience that personally? That you are on the vanguard of something more profound, a fundamental shift in human existence, right? That it ties you into some broader narrative, and in a sense, it's a purpose. It creates purpose, is what I think romanticism is intended to do, or at least a feeling of purpose, right? Which is why it can be so powerful, but obviously also so dangerous as it has been deployed in history. So again, I think there has been a general kind of agreed upon set of those types of values that NASA has deployed over the years. But it's interesting to me, like if you look at some of the ways that NASA talks about what it wants to do in like the 1970s, right after Apollo, compared to now, like you look at it like, oh my God, like what the heck were they smoking? This is wild what they were going to say. You know, that's where a lot of this funding for, O'Neill and others kind of the early concept studies were coming out, where it's like ambitions, like we're going to live on Mars in 1986 and all this. It was this level of, I think, inheriting that kind of romantic past for the people who were in charge by then, who had integrated that all as kids. It was a far more ambitious and kind of broader thing. You know, I mean, right now, NASA doesn't even say officially we want to have people living on Mars full time. It's always to go back. You know, it's a very kind of scientific back and forth. So I think re-embracing aspects of that and maybe tuning it to sound a little more honest, and ironically, maybe finding more individuals who can express that as part of this larger commitment may be the way forward.
Can take another.
I'm by no means an expert in any of this, but from my perspective and a lot of people that I talk to in the industry, it seems like, SpaceX came in and they were like, we're going to move fast. We're going to blow things up, right? We're going to throw a lot of money at it, right? And I think nowadays you look at NASA and people may think, oh, it's slow. You got all this bureaucracy, like waterfall development. We have to check every line. It has to be perfect before we can do that one launch and it's going to work, right? And I guess I'm wondering from your perspective, how do we reconcile this difference of fail fast, spend a lot of money, blow up until it works, versus let's get it right the first time?
Right. I mean, I think you could have a whole second talk about how NASA, in a sense, has brought it on itself. If you accept my kind of framing of this as a challenge, and that by over bureaucratizing and over, in a sense, going for the acceptable reason, which isn't always NASA's fault. There's Congress applies its laws in various ways to things and demands a lot of transparency. But I think that's been one of the fundamental challenges, right? And I think that's why I kept saying for people born in the 20th century, 21st century, obviously SpaceX is going to be the definition of what kind of space, I think, facilitates people's relationship to space now, particularly if you're not in the industry. And that's a bad place to be, right? And you don't want to be, in a sense, outcompeted from a marketing standpoint by your own creation to some extent. And so, no, I am a very strong critic of a lot of what NASA does. And I think that's an aspect of this, is that there's a lot that we need to improve in terms of what we enable people to do in a national program, or that we leverage. And I think my argument doesn't cut off the idea of partnering with private companies either, right? It's just knowing where to partner with them and who's at the steering wheel of setting the policies, right? So things like rocket development, I think pretty conclusively doesn't need to be a government project anymore, right? And that's not a unique capability of government. So maybe we could deploy those resources to things that don't need to explode every second, or on a smaller scale so no one notices if they do, right? There's also, I mean, there's an interesting aspect of this that I think that NASA, the downside of being a national symbol is that when you fail, it's not just you failing, right? It is a national failure, right? Says something like there's a congressional hearing or op-eds written like, this says something about the nation that we can't do X anymore. And it's like, just let us blow up a rocket or two, right? And in a sense, having a private company do the rocket development, NASA's able, in a sense, to protect its reputation and allow another company to take on that risk of failure without having the same burden of symbolism applied to them. I don't know how you reconcile that part. I mean, that's the good and bad about being a national symbol, right? Obviously it has a lot of benefits, but then you are held to a potentially unreasonably high standard at the same time.
We have a question. We can take one from online and then we come back. What is your personal romantic vision for our future in space?
My personal romantic vision. It's finding life, which I don't know if I can control, but my vision would be, I mean, that's where I think, and what I've really felt in the last year or two is this realization that how we even talk about space is losing its, to me, it's becoming more utilitarian and becoming more focused and extractive relationship. It's like, what can space do for me? And that, again, that doesn't mean, that's an important question. We should have that, and it should be doing stuff for us, and it can. But how it gives us access to part of our experience and part of ourselves that I think we've lost in a lot of ways in our modern society, to be able to look and feel something like the idea of the sublime, right? A great book that I recently read is by Chris Kokinos, which was about looking at the moon, right? And is him going through all the, lunar, observing the moon with a telescope and naming, it's like bird watching for the moon, but also tying it to the idea of really looking at something celestial and really letting yourself disappear into it. And these ideas of just letting your ego just quiet down a little bit and become small against something, the immensity, finding life and finding in a sense, this broader implication for not just biology as a convergent outcome of chemistry, but that we are ourselves as humanity could maybe use a little ego check and just say that we are part of something, bigger as well. That to me is the ultimate romantic ideal, that we have abilities to bring ourselves to access the sublime on a daily basis, which to balance out some of our more, neurotic compulsive behaviors of seeing what everyone else is doing, the equivalent of sitting at the high school cafeteria table and gossiping.
Very good. Thank you so much. We can take another in person here.
Hey, I'm wondering what can we, like the employees of public and private companies and researchers and students and technicians, what can we concretely do to help?
Good question. I think there's a couple things we can all do. One is talking about, I think, the unique strengths. So I think that, and it's not that a lot of people do, and there's a tendency, of course, for nuance to flatten out into confidence in the ways that we discuss things online these days. Communicating with your elected officials about these unique roles, about what you expect a public agency to do. And then also, I think, again, to your friends and family even say, oh, when you hear, and as I've heard many times, why do we need NASA anymore, right? SpaceX is doing X, Y, and Z. Emphasizing that, oh, well, they don't do this. We need to do this. And just that fundamental level of communication, I think even becoming more comfortable with, to the extent one's individual proclivities allow, that discussion of that more right-brain romantic side, right? To kind of use that to not just argue as if you're giving a list of bullet points, but can you touch someone's soul about why we are doing this in a grand sense? And I remember one of my early days at the Planetary Society, I was tabling, right? Sitting at a table. It was at a national park. And back in those days, we had a little piece of a Martian meteorite that we had on a platter that people could come up and just touch, right? And I always loved that idea, right? Oh, you can go, have you touched Mars today, right? Like, no, I haven't. Like, great. Since, how often do I get to touch a planet 100 million miles away? And so most people, we would walk by, it's like, hey, you want to touch a piece of Mars? People, whoa, that's cool. And kids would come up, be really excited, and, touch a piece of Mars. You just have that tactile relationship. I remember very distinctly this older guy walking by, and I go like, hey, he kind of looked, he's like, hey, you want to touch a piece of Mars? And he went like, no. And just like walked on, right? And I just like, at that moment, it's like, there are people very different than me out there. And, but, it's like, that was it. I don't know if that person's reachable, but you don't want to become that person, right? And unless you have something stirring your soul every now and then, you might become that person. Kind of, you let that part of yourself die. And that's a really important part of human existence. And I think space and what space gives us through discovery and the collective effort and the grand things that we can do are a counterpoint to that effort. So again, just talk to your friends and family about these things. I think it's actually fundamentally, I think the more we're comfortable about doing it, I think the more we can make this, that it's a bigger, there's something more to it than just measurable.
I think I'm going to take one online. I know there are a lot of good questions, maybe one more in person, and then we can close it. So the question is, do you know if NASA has been a model for other countries' policies, maybe influencing, or if other countries have made changes or influenced US policies or NASA in particular?
Interesting. Yeah. Has NASA been model for other countries' policies? That's they're like, depending on how you slice up what you mean by model for which policies, yes, in some ways. Maybe in the ways that I'm talking about. NASA's so weird from its generation, right? From its genesis because of that Cold War period that it's hard to use as a model in a lot of ways. I think India's is a really interesting comparison in that India has one of the actually oldest space programs in the world. I think its first sounding rocket started launching in '63, and it went into orbit in the '80s, but it had its own kind of space program, what became ISRO, really kicking up in the '70s, a lot earlier again than a lot of other nations. And unlike Soviet Union and NASA activities, that was a relentlessly utilitarian space program for the longest time, because in a sense it came out almost in a way that kind of ESA is a very practical space program. And again, this isn't a critique, it's just like we're delivering these contracts and these things, and we do, broad social good stuff, and no human space flight, no kind of grand narrative stuff. But starting in the last 20 years, ISRO has been starting to shift into more ambitious activities, like sending its probes to the moon and to Mars and trying to actually get up a human spaceflight program. And so it's actually moving from a very focused utilitarian, we're going to send up satellites and timing and navigation satellites to help, farmers and our ships and blah, 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 into let's send humans into space. And I think it's adding that, seeing there's some like broader narrative power in terms of what that adds to it. So I think there's a version of that is being seen. A lot of countries at the moment though are actually going in the other. They're like racing to build up private and commercial economies for space in their countries. And again, that's actually probably a really good thing. But at the end of the day, I think keeping that there's this role that those companies just won't do by structure is going to be the difficult one.
Good, thank you. There was a question here.
Hey, thank you for your talk. That was fascinating. I want to avoid asking like why invest in intangible X when you need Y, but you're talking about this collective, romantic, maybe even spiritual vision for investing in public space. And if you're trying to pitch that to an audience that may experience scarcity or low institutional trust, where do you start?
Well, I think actually the appeal to romanticism gets you past a lot of, if you start with, actually, like it gives you jobs and it gives you this, number of economic multiplier in your district, and for every dollar NASA spends, $2.8 are created in your economy and so forth. That, while it's true, all of those are true, I think, in my experience, those are hard to break through a fundamental level of skepticism. I think, ironically, a passionate defense on values and again, this is romantic ideals as a shorthand for this, can help get through a barrier because it tingles some emotional sense and they're open to it, and they feel good. Because at the end of the day, people need to feel okay with it, right? And you can always add, it's not taking anything away, right? NASA's right now, 0.3% of the national expenditures. You could, fun fact, if NASA never existed and you took all the money we'd ever spent on NASA and applied it to the national deficit this year, we would still have the deficit, right? Since 1950, it's true. So in my case, I actually think the emotional appeal tends to cut through hesitation, and obviously you may have to do it artfully or be in a way connected to that community that you're speaking to. But I actually think opening with that is a stronger move, and then adding in some of the detail than starting with the practical stuff before that.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time. You definitely left us with something to think about.
Okay, good.
There are a lot more questions coming through Slack. Please follow up. Another round of applause to
Yeah.
Casey.
Thank you.